Good evening, everyone. I'm David Throb, president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California, and we're thrilled to present the second part of our two-part series with our dear friend Jose Yulo on this book, Progress and Religion, by Christopher Dawson. Jose, please proceed, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, David. Last time we spent, or at least Dawson spent some time discussing progress and what that meant as a movement from the Enlightenment of the 18th century onwards. This section, the second part of the book, Dawson will actually take up religion and explain how one particular kind of religion, this being Christianity, developed in a bit of a different way than others that had come even before it and those that were developing along its time as well. Along the way of describing religion, Dawson will also, how should we say, share a bit of the DNA of progress, the progress we learned of last week with the Enlightenment, how that is somehow connected quite strongly to Christianity as it develops as a religion, as it fully matures as a religion throughout the centuries. That being said, for those who are new this week, we're doing this lecture in conjunction with visuals. It's an homage to an old friend, a family friend of ours in the Philippines. Father James Donnellan was an old Jesuit priest in the Philippines who went to Oxford and was an English lit guy, but who was a very dear Yulo family friend who used to give a series of lectures called the Grand Tour, similar to the Grand Tours that Europeans used to take throughout the continent to educate them on the arts and the origins of their own civilization. I'm trying to do the same thing with showing you different visuals that will try to illustrate more fully the points that Dawson brings up in his writing. So in order to begin, at least to show us, if we think of a theme for today, it would be along the lines of finding the DNA of progress, this movement we learned last week about, but finding it within a particular story, in this case, the particular story of Christianity. So I'd like to read from you from Dawson's book first before we begin sharing or screen sharing from our visuals. This is from page 98 of the of Progress and Religion. It's the last paragraph on page 98, so I'll go with this one. Nevertheless, in the first millennium BC, a cultural change of the most profound significance passed over the world, a change that was not confined to any one people or culture, but which made itself felt almost simultaneously from India to the Mediterranean and from China to Persia. It was, however, a change of thought rather than a revolution of material culture. It was due to the first appearance of new spiritual forces, which have been active in the world ever since, and which still influence the minds of men today. The teachings of the Hebrew prophets and the Greek philosophers, of Buddha and the authors of the Upanishads, of Confucius and Lao Tzu, are not the half-comprehended relics of a vanished world. Like the religious literature of Egypt and Babylonia, they are of perennial significance and value. Dawson is introducing us to a particular kind of thought and faith that develops at this particular moment in history, right around the Bronze Age, about 3,000 years ago or so. There are different movements from different parts of the world, but just to give you an illustration of what the world was like before this in terms of faith, I'd like to turn to and share our first visual today, at least to give a little bit of context. At the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, a museum, by the way, famed for its collection of Near Eastern or Middle Eastern art and artifacts. This is the fabled Ishtar Gate of Babylon, about 38 feet high, a very magnificent structure that once guarded that mighty city of Babylon. This was roughly a city of 200,000 people in about 575 BC. And this gate itself was built by Nebuchadnezzar II. I'm sure you're familiar with him from the Bible, king of Babylon. Some would call it Neo-Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, in contrast to the older Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi, etc. This was a structure that was obviously quite large. If we can look in terms of perspective, if you can follow my arrow down here, this is a hallway. I'll enlarge it slightly. This is a hallway leading to another portion of the Pergamon Museum. You can see here a pillar from a Greek exhibit in the other room, which is rather high, which gives perspective to how massive this construction of the Ishtar gate is. It is a unique structure and particularly brilliant in its construction and also aesthetics. If you notice, it is almost all blue, of course, with a little bit of bordering of gold and yellow. The blue, it's still a matter of contention today, whether these were literally lapis lazuli bricks, very precious, by the way, in the ancient world and also today, a precious stone, or whether they were somehow bricks that were infused with some sort of dye from lapis lazuli. We're not entirely sure. But this was done to, according to Nebuchadnezzar, to portray or to inspire wonder in the people who would look at this, who would come to Babylon as an ancient city and marvel at this kind of construction. If we also notice the motifs of animals on the sides of the outside of the building, we have here, right here, it's a repeated pattern, by the way, but just to make it a little bit larger, this is a pattern, we can call it, of a bull. There was an ancient form of bovine called an aurochs, which is closer to what this would be. This was symbolic of one of the gods of the city of Babylon, the god Adad, who was more of a weather god, who would bring good rains in times of drought for the crops that were being planted there. Scrolling down a little bit, we see a very odd type of animal that we can best describe as some kind of dragon. It even has a forked tongue right here. It's a mixture of different animals. It has almost lions, claws up here, a snake in the form of a tail, scales on a body. This particular mythical creature was meant to symbolize the god Marduk, who was the patron god of the city of Babylon, the god who fought the forces of chaos, who symbolized the struggle of good versus evil in the city, and therefore being immortalized, if you will, in this particular visual. Important to note also, this the Gate of Babylon, though built in 575 BC, was only rediscovered really by German archaeologists right around the turn of the last century. So around 1899 or so, excavations began to show what this structure once looked like to the outside world. It was very much memorable to the people living in its time as something that communicated the might of Babylon as an empire and the power it had in the ancient Middle Eastern world at the time. The second visual also is part of this Ishtar gate, and it is closely related to the name itself. If we look closely, we see a mixture of two different things. We see flowering plants right here, which are perhaps connoting the presence of the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar was a goddess in the ancient world, in ancient Babylonia, of actually some pretty interesting things. She was a goddess of fertility, of sex, and ironically also war. How you can be a goddess all these different things at the same time is it's a mystery to me. But then again, that's multitasking in the ancient world. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, also a symbol of Ishtar, the goddess, these lions that you see, also presenting the trio of beasts or creatures you find in the Ishtar gate, the dragon for Marduk, the aurochs for Adad, and lastly, we have the lion symbolic of Ishtar. Now, one thing I'd like to throw out, and this is like a little theory of mine, which may or may not hold too much water, but we'll see. Right around the time that Nebuchadnezzar is building this, around 575 BC or so, 25 years have passed, more or less, maybe 30 years have passed, ever since the Neo-Babylonians, along with the Persians, defeated the forces of the ancient Assyrians. If you remember a talk I gave last week, if you were here, I'm sorry, last year, I gave a talk where I went into detail about the ancient Assyrian culture. Lions were a very big deal to that culture. The great kings of Assyria used to go on lion hunts to prove their might and superiority to the other peoples of the ancient world. Now, it's just my little 2 cents, but perhaps along with being symbolic of the goddess Ishtar, the close placement with the flowering plants right here and the lions, these two images being connotative of this particular goddess, I'd throw in a possibility, just maybe, that perhaps this was also symbolic of the Neo-Babylonians being victorious over Assyria. Perhaps a symbol of their dominance, showing on the very face of the Ishtar gate not only an animal that is symbolic of one of their goddesses, but an animal that is symbolic of one of their enemies who had now been defeated. Now, going back to what was originally said, what I was originally hinting at with regards to the purpose, the telos, if you will, the purpose of building this Ishtar gate. It was meant to communicate magnificence. It was meant to inspire awe. But here's one of the things where it perhaps falls short. I'm guessing that many of us who've read of Babylon before in the Old Testament are familiar with how Babylon is often associated with, dare I say, a challenging standard of morality. One that is not too often kept, standards that are often cast aside, where people are often doing what they want, hence the term Babylon as a pejorative term in that sense. There is one thing that the gods and the religion of ancient Babylonia could not really inspire people to. Now, it could inspire awe. It could inspire a feeling of being dumbstruck almost at the grandeur of these gates and the fine work that went into portraying the religion of the ancient Babylonians. But there is one thing that this particular faith, with all of its many gods and goddesses, had a hard time doing. And that thing is inspiring people towards something we call virtue. In ancient Mesopotamian lore, as it contrasts with ancient Egyptian religion, the afterlife in ancient Mesopotamia did not have an overly sophisticated way of conveying either punishments or rewards that were given to those who lived certain kinds of lives. In fact, there are certain accounts of the afterlife in ancient Mesopotamia being a place where your soul went to when you died, after you were told, by the way, by the gods, throughout all of your life, that your purpose as a human being was to work very hard, do your job, plant your crops, but eventually you were going to die. You were serving the gods in that manner. And when you died, your soul went to an afterlife where it literally sat around and ate soil, dirt, forever. No great salvific message, no great call to living a better life than what you're doing right now. Hence, a millennium before Nebuchadnezzar, when Hammurabi the Great was ruling over Babylon, he had to implement, you've probably heard of Hammurabi's code, this very, very harsh set of laws, wherein if you transgress certain boundaries in society, you would lose your limb, you would lose your life in some cases. There is perhaps this notion in ancient Babylonia that although the gods and this kind of faith could inspire certain things such as majesty and awe, it could not really inspire towards virtue. It could not convince you to live a good life. The most it could do, perhaps, is to convince you not to live a bad life, not to do bad things. Well, why? Because you were afraid that if you lived a bad life, the law would come for you and you would lose your life or limbs or be maimed or some other horrible thing. But that was really your only encouragement to live a life that was somewhat approaching virtue. There was no great reward for being a good person. In fact, if a bad person, someone who lived a life where he caused great harm to others around where that person lived, would be treated exactly the same manner as a person who was kind and considerate, then what was the real motivation towards virtue in this kind of society? So we have perhaps a civilization and a faith. In the words, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, of the University of Chicago historian William McNeill, who pointed out that eventually the religious systems of Mesopotamia would eventually become fossilized, would literally turn to stone. There would be no great enervating impulse from the people to keep it alive. It was something that had run its course. Now, mind you, it was a very long course. This religion lasted quite some time, several millennia. But after a certain point, it's as if the people who believed in this faith began asking the question, perhaps the question that Greek philosophers will ask a whole bunch, the question of telos. What's the point? What is the purpose of this faith? Aside from telling us to plant, to live lives, and then go and eat dirt in the afterlife, there is nothing really overly compelling about this religion. Now, in contrast to this, and getting back to the Dawson quote that I read to you earlier, if I could shift to the very next visual, there is one thing that I learned, not the hard way, in fact, the pleasant way, when one goes to various cathedrals and churches throughout Europe. It is nice, it is a good idea once you enter those doors to look up. This is the ceiling of the Baptistery of San Giovanni in Florence. It is the building that is right next to the Duomo there, the Great Cathedral of Santa Maria della Fiore. It is an ancient building that first began its construction more or less in the 4th century AD, whereas this particular ceiling and the mosaic you see in there will come around a little bit later. The baptistry was consecrated in 1059 AD, and then hence many famous Florentines were baptized in this building, including Dante himself, I've read, received this baptism in this particular building. The art that you see in the ceiling, quite majestic, by the way. The very first time I went and saw this building, strolling with my wife towards in the central area around the Duomo, we entered the baptistry and just saw this magnificent ceiling. It is done in a very, if I can just enlarge this a little bit more. One thing you can tell by looking at the art, of course, gold background, you're thinking Byzantine and Greek art. That was the style, of course, that came before the Renaissance, or proto-Renaissance, we'll see a little bit later. This kind of art was in common with most of the ancient world before things began going in different directions right around the Middle Ages. Gold background, of course, connoting the Byzantine type of art. If we look at the way Christ is being portrayed here, he is very much Christos Pantokrator, Christ the all-powerful. We see this, if you've seen Byzantine art in the past, it sort of looks flat in a way, but it's not really doing it justice if I say that. Notice, if you will, we had this when I gave this talk last year, how in Byzantine art, the placement of the legs of a sitting figure, if you have one leg higher than the other, it implies a certain direction pointing towards you, the viewer. It creates, if you will, and this I heard from a painter of icons who is still alive today, it creates a space. It's as if the figure is descending down towards us. And bear in mind, the use of gold is meant to imply heaven. If we look above Christos Pantokrator, the various members of the heavenly host, virtues, thrones, etc., all above in this region right here. Now, what is unique, of course, about this faith that separates it, in the words of Dawson, from what came before, specifically the old Egyptian or Babylonian faith? Now, if we look a little bit more distance here to give more perspective, if we look specifically at Christ Pantokrator, his hands are being used in very interesting ways. We see, of course, the holes from the crucifixion, both hands and both feet. But look, if you will, at the right hand over here. It has its palm extended upward. This implies, in a manner, if we look at human body language, it implies somewhat of an invitation. It implies something being called towards this figure. It's as if Christ is calling those who this hand is pointing toward to come closer towards him. If we took a look lower or beneath where his hand is, we see what look like tombs and figures being reborn or perhaps released from these tombs by members of the heavenly host over here, with their wings connoting some type of angel. Again, the hand being open and held up, inviting those, you will, on his right side toward him. Now look, if you will, what happens at Christ's left hand. This is the kind of motion that you would do, by the way. It's something very basic in human nature. If we see something that we don't like, that we want to keep away from ourselves, it is usually the palm outward that is facing that which we are not too comfortable with, either as a threat, either as something we don't want anything to deal with. So this hand is pointing towards a different direction from where Christ is sitting. If we look down a little bit, we're going to see something rather interesting. this particular work in the ceiling mosaics in the Baptistery in Florence was crafted by an artist called Coppo di Marcovaldo. Coppo was one of Florence's great artists in a period that came before the Renaissance. In fact, he came before a slightly more famous artist called Cimabue. If you've heard of him, Cimabue, of course, eventually became teacher of a man called Giotto. Giotto is an early proto or pre-Renaissance artist. What you're seeing with Coppo di Marcovaldo's work is a kind of art that is bridging the gap between the older Greek style, the older Byzantine Greek style, to later on the oncoming Florentine style, which we'll see a little bit more as we go forward. But going back to the actual subject here, we see not so pleasant looking creatures with wings, and they are also lifting people from tombs, not too comfortably, I would say. Towards 2 o'clock right here, we see a gigantic monster devouring souls. This was seen to be Satan. And this, of course, is called the Last Judgment. That is where souls would eventually go in keeping with again, this hand. Not inviting, but perhaps pointing the way to another destination. Now, what becomes interesting about this faith, about Christianity, is not necessarily that there is reward or punishment. Reward or punishment, by the way, if you're familiar with Egyptian religion, the ancient Egyptian religion, the Book of the Dead of ancient Egypt will literally lay out that there are rewards and punishments in the afterlife, depending on what kind of life you lived. But what makes Christianity different in this sense than the old Egyptian polytheistic religion, which involves reward and punishment in the afterlife. But what makes Christianity different is that, yes, there is reward and there is punishment. But what makes this unique is this hand right here. The reward is not merely to go to some kind of afterlife where we eat fancy foods with the gods, like the Greeks, where we go to the Elysian fields and enjoy a pleasant life in the afterlife. The whole point to a reward is to be invited to be with this God. To be with, and I'm bringing a little bit of Plato here, a little bit of Platonic philosophy from ancient Greece, to be with the source of all goodness. There is a coming together. There is a unity and wholeness to this faith, which makes it, as it grows through the centuries, far more appealing than what had come before. You see one God, of course, 3 persons, but one God not telling people, okay, you did bad things, you go over there. You did good things, I'll give you some nice rewards. But saying your reward is to be with me, is to be with all goodness, love, happiness, etc. This is an extremely compelling message, especially to ancient peoples who've been taught of religions where pagan gods don't really want to have anything to do with people. I mean, in ancient Mesopotamia, we were literally the workers of the gods. That's all we were supposed to do. Work the fields, plant the crops, and then go die and eat dirt afterwards. But here, this God who is all-powerful is inviting people to come and be with him. This provides a very compelling message of the time. And dare I say, closing note on this, dare I say this provides a new living kind of faith. This is what Dawson is trying to get at, that the compelling nature of Christianity provides vitality, provides life, provides energy to the people who would follow this faith, who would want to follow this faith willingly, as differs from a faith which is more or less static, which is not really changing that much, and there is no chance of salvation, in that afterlife, especially in the ancient Mesopotamian form of religion. Okay, now, aside from being unique in its reward insofar as it brings the believers closer to or with God, there is something else that makes Christianity quite distinct from anything else that is existing at that time. If I could draw your attention to page 135 of the Dawson book. This second point of difference, which makes Christianity unique, will be embodied in the visuals you'll be seeing, will be embodied in the life and work of 2 saints, the first of these being St. Francis of Assisi, and the second being St. Thomas Aquinas. Two different, very, very different men. If you've read them, by the way, Chesterton's biography of both, I once did a C.S. Lewis book club review back at David and Mary's house many years ago on both of these books by Chesterton. They're both excellent if you'd like to read them. Chesterton does a masterful job of writing in a way that matches the character. He writes in a way that matches Francis, and he writes more philosophically in a way that matches Thomas Aquinas. So again, just a little shout out for me to G.K. Chesterton. Again, a fantastic writer in that sense. So if I could bring up page 135 from Dawson, and just get to the right place. Okay, this is about the middle of the page in 135, where Dawson is describing the first of this duo that make Christianity rather unique, and this being Francis of Assisi. In quotes, Dawson says, "The ideal of St. Francis is to relive the life of Christ in the experience of daily life. There is no longer any separation between faith and life, or between the spiritual and the material, since the two worlds have become fused together in the living reality of practical experience." Focus on the term fused together, putting two things together that you would not normally think would go together. So for the visual for this particular quote, also from Florence, this is found at the Santa Croce Church, the old Franciscan church in Florence. This is called the Bardi panel, B-A-R-D-I. It is a panel describing events in the life of Francis of Assisi. In Italian, San Francisco, eventi storie della sua vita. Francis and 20 stories about his life or from his life in that sense. The materials that compose this particular work of art, rather humble. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a mixture of humble and noble, I would say. It's a wooden panel, so obviously wood. The paint that you see is tempera, which, if you're familiar with ancient, even Renaissance art, it's basically eggs that are used to lay over this paint. But there is also, if you notice the background, it happens to be gold. So you have this fusion of something quite humble and basic, like wood and tempera, and then also this element of gold, at least communicating that Francis was not all of this world. There was part of him, of course, that was married to the divine and very closely attached to heaven. Now, to give you a little bit of context to Francis and why this fusing of two worlds is very important. If anybody's read before the poetry of William Butler Yeats, Yeats has a poem called Sailing to Byzantium. One of my favorites, by the way. It's a beautiful poem, where in one of the stanzas that Yeats is writing about an old man at the end of his life who is longing for something else. And his mind goes to this great golden civilization that once stood as Constantinople, of course, the Byzantine Empire, centuries ago. The particular line from Yeats that comes to mind goes along these lines. "O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic on a wall, come from the holy fire, turn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul." When we see Byzantine art, where we see saints depicted in Byzantine art, they are frozen in this golden amber, this golden field we see beyond us, yes? We think of the civilization that tries to remind us of heaven. Think again of what you just last saw in the ceiling in Florence. We think of an emphasis in the Byzantine style of art to make us not worry about this world too much, but to turn our attention towards the divine, towards the realm of heaven in that sense. But here's where things get a little bit different. The narrator, again in Yeats' poem, yes, is asking the sages, these wise men, standing in the holy fire, in the field of gold you see in front of you, to come down and instruct this person, to enliven this person, because this person is near the end of his life. He wants to feel that rush again, that great feeling of life again. But in this stanza of the poem by Yeats, we see, I don't want to call it a detachment, but we do see a bit of distance, in the sense that Byzantine art, in making us focus on the divine, in inviting us to contemplate, by the way, the divine, sometimes to some people or to some minds may appear perhaps more remote, not often too grounded in the realities of this earthly existence. And here's where Francis changes things a little bit. This particular work of art, again, tempera, wood, and gold. The date for this, roughly 1245 to 1250 AD. So about, give or take, 800 years ago when this was constructed. It was housed in the Bardi chapel. When that was being restored, that's where I saw it at Santa Croce in Florence. It fits, by the way, very much with the humility of the wood and the tempera, Francis's own ethos, his own character, of not being overly ostentatious or resplendent in noble materials. Yes, you do have gold, but that's balanced off a little bit by the more humble materials. If we look closer at the scenes of Francis's life, I'm going to point out a couple over here that stand out. Right where my arrow is over here. This is a scene of Francis receiving his stigmata, his wounds that paralleled Christ's wounds on the cross. If we go slightly more to the left and down, Francis preaching to the Muslims, which was also part of his life, of course, going to the Middle East and engaging in some kind of outreach to Muslims. But then if we go over here, one of the stories Francis is most famous for, Francis is preaching to birds. Now, there's an interesting backstory behind this. St. Bonaventure, when he wrote his biography of Francis, told the story of Francis being at a certain point of his life and wondering whether he should merely retreat from the world and devote himself to a life of prayer, or if he should continue preaching God's saving grace to all of humanity. Well, not only all of humanity, but to all creatures. He sends out for advice, first through Brother Sylvester, secondly to the Lady Clare, who I believe will eventually become Saint Clare of Assisi. The advice directed back towards Francis, specifically by Saint Clare, was that, look, your job is to keep on preaching. Don't retreat into this monastic, cloistered life where you stay behind walls looking at sages standing in God's holy fire, like Yeats would say in his poem, but go out into the world and keep on sharing God's message to all. And St. Bonaventure, in his biography of Francis, says that the very first people, or not people, the very first beings that Francis decides to lecture to are birds, are simply a flock of birds who apparently take his message rather well, who follow him in their own sort of body language as to what he's saying, and then go on and fly off. This is the fusion that Dawson was speaking about earlier. Francis is saying no creature, no matter how humble, no matter how seemingly lowly, is a creature that we can somehow lord over. We are all part of creation's family. We are all fused together. The heavenly and the earthly are one whole thing. We should not mistreat or maltreat the creatures of the earth simply because they're not heavenly. We should appreciate them as best as we can, as members of the same family in that sense. So again, with Francis, we see this concept, at least Dawson is speaking about what makes Christianity very viable during this time period, is that it is presenting itself as a faith that has a sense of, dare I say, wholeness, a faith that has unity, that brings together the immaterial and the material. Francis is not of this world. Obviously, he is very much a man of God, a man of the cloth, but he is not neglecting this world. He is very much appreciative of the gifts that God has granted us on this earthly plane, and treating them as members of the same family of creatures in that sense. Now, in contrast to this, we see Thomas Aquinas' influence in a little bit of a different way. Aquinas can be said to be conveying the same message. This is what Dawson would say. Aquinas would be conveying a very similar message to Francis, but done in a different way, in a way more in keeping with his philosophical nature, more in keeping with his focus on the immaterial and the transcendent. So if I could draw your attention before I shift to the next visual, to page 139 in the Dawson book. This actually crosses over from 138 first. So on 138, this is the last paragraph of 138, beginning with "It is true." So again, this is Dawson describing how Thomas has his own way of presenting this wholeness of Christianity. Dawson writes, "It is true that St. Thomas had no intention of turning men's minds away from the spiritual world to the study of particular and contingent being. His philosophical ideal, as Pierre Rousseau has shown, is emphatically an absolute intellectualism, and he regards the science of the sensible world merely as the lowest rung in a ladder which leads the mind step by step to the contemplation of eternal truth. Nevertheless, the new appreciation of the rights of nature and reason, which his philosophy involved, marked a turning point in the history of human thought. The human mind," very important here, "the human mind was no longer absorbed in on the contemplation of the eternal and the unchanging. It was set free to take up once more its natural task of the material organization of the world by science and law." To give this a little bit more of a visual, from another church in Florence, this time the Santa Maria Novella church in Florence. It is the Dominican church in that city. It is the church, by the way, if you travel to Florence by train, which I very much would suggest you do. If you get off at Santa Maria Novella train station, it is literally right out the door. The church is right there at the center of the city. I'm very grateful to my son for taking us on a tour, my wife and myself, when he was studying in Florence, of this wonderful church and what it has in not only in construction, but in art as well. So this is St. Thomas Aquinas. It is a stained glass window, obviously. The craftsman who constructed this was the rather famous artist Ghirlandaio, Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was the teacher himself of Michelangelo. A small side story on Ghirlandaio and Michelangelo. There's an account wherein Michelangelo's father wanted his son to have the very best art instruction. So he conveyed a message to Ghirlandaio asking him, "Hey, I'd like to pay you to instruct my son in art. What's the price going to be?" When Ghirlandaio put forward his asking price for instruction, I guess it was rather high, because Michelangelo's father kind of balked at it and said, "Oh, that's not going to work out. This is simply too much money." Ghirlandaio was surprised when shortly thereafter, young Michelangelo, comes over to him and does not ask for a discount, mind you, for his instruction. But what Michelangelo tells Ghirlandaio is he will study with Ghirlandaio, but Ghirlandaio should pay him because he is that talented. You should pay me to study with you in that sense. It's a testament to Ghirlandaio's humility. When he saw Michelangelo's first work, he said, "You know what, kid, you're right. I'm going to pay you. I'm going to pay you and subsidize you a little bit because I see something very, very special here." So that small story on the side between Ghirlandaio and his rather famous student Michelangelo. So you see this right here. Of course, it's a stained glass portrayal of St. Thomas. We have here the garment that St. Thomas is often depicted with, this black robe with stars. Dominican priests, by the way, not with the stars, but you do see this black and white color combination whenever you meet priests with the OP at the end, order of preachers, like St. Thomas Aquinas was. The stars on the mantle. And note, if you will, another heavenly body, a sun in the hand of Thomas Aquinas, shining its rays into this little church over here. This conveys to us a message a little bit different than St. Francis. Aquinas is more of a contemplative, philosophical priest. He is less involved in the comings and goings of the mortal world, some would say, but he is more absorbed in spending his time thinking about that which is eternal and true. Now, what makes Aquinas interesting is that, and what Dawson speaks of, yes, he sees the natural world, the world of nature. He doesn't necessarily say we shouldn't study it at all. He says, yes, I may not place it at the same level that I place the study of the eternal, the study of God, theology, but they are still rungs connected in the same ladder. There's still wholeness to it. There is still unity to these two realms. They're not divorced from each other, and they should be studied together, sort of constructively together in that sense. This particular work of art, and Thomas Aquinas' thrust according to what Dawson is writing, gives us another added element as to this union of the material and the immaterial. Again, if you note, just zooming out a little bit, this is a fairly intricate work of art by Ghirlandaio. In order to create this, by the way, in order to construct this particular stained glass window, numerous things have to take place, yes? Ghirlandaio may have the original idea, may have the concept of what this will eventually look like. But there are numerous types of moves, if you will, numerous types of steps that have to occur before we get the finished product right here of the stained glass window. Well, for number one, unlike tempera and wood and gold that we have in St. Francis, you need glass. You need stained glass specifically. So Ghirlandaio would have to contact somebody whose specialty would be the firing up of silica and sand in order to make glass. The other person who may have to be contacted would be the person who knew how to make dyes, who knew how to use metals to make dyes that could infuse in the glass to give us the very rich color palette you see in front of you. Not merely black and white for the stars, but this very rich, almost cobalt blue over here, various shades of autumn reds and browns and golds. This masterful work, really, of the person who is in charge of infusing the glass with this dye. The other person who may have to be contacted is the person who specialized in cutting the glass, in making sure that these things would actually fit into one solid body of a window and not fall apart. Another person who may have to be contacted would be a very simple person who would literally, with a ladder or a series of ladders, build or at least lift this construction up to its elevated position in Santa Maria Novella Church. Now note, if you will, I said moves and numerous things that have to come into play before we see this as an actual finished product. If you're familiar with Thomas Aquinas' proofs of the existence of God, number one of these proofs is the proof based on motion and movement. But this could also mean the proof based on change, or a series of changes that lead from potency to act, to a final product, if you will. So here's what Aquinas says. Aquinas would say that there has to have been what he calls God, a first mover. Because if we look at things in nature that are moving, we notice they are being moved by something else. And those things which are being moved by something else are in turn being moved by something else. So if we take this process and go backward, sort of backward in time, if you will, or backward in sequence, Aquinas will say that ultimately you have to have a first mover. Ultimately, it has to stop somewhere. There has to be a first unmoved mover, which he calls God. Now, why does Aquinas say you have to have this? Well, think of it this way. If there is no first mover, let's just say that Ghirlandaio wanted to construct this stained glass window of Thomas Aquinas based on an inspiration from God. So let's call Ghirlandaio a second mover. He was the person who got the ball rolling. Then, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, he then contacts the person who specializes in making glass. Third mover. Maybe he contacts the person who is the great creator of dyes. Fourth mover in that sense. Then he contacts the person who specializes in cutting glass. Fifth, sixth, etc., leading up to this final work of art you see in front of you. Now, here's where Aquinas, where he is asking us to trust our reason, our rational capacity. Aquinas will say, if there was no God or first mover, then we're kind of negating Ghirlandaio next. If we take away the first mover, there cannot be a secondary mover. Neither can there be a third mover, or a fourth, or a fifth. So ultimately, what we're saying is, with our reason, and Aquinas is asking us to trust our reason, if there is no prime mover, no first mover, then we don't have the stained glass window. But what do our senses tell us? And if you go to Florence, by the way, strong suggestion for me, please do go and see this wonderful window at the Santa Maria Novella. Our senses tell us you do have this window. And this didn't just happen by itself. There had to have been a series of moves, of changes that led to this window. And of course, if we examine this backward, it leads us to contemplating the first or prime mover, the unmoved mover, something that gets everything else in motion. So again, like Francis of Assisi, although I would say on a scale that is slightly more vertical than Francis of Assisi, we see the combination of the material and the immaterial. Where do we see this? By examining what makes up this glass window. We're examining the physical world. We're looking at physics. We're looking at chemistry, the composition of the glass that goes into this build, the composition of the dye, the wood, the lead, whatever goes into this particular work of art. But by examining the material, Aquinas is saying, if we keep on using our reason and we don't stop, the examination of the material invariably, inevitably perhaps, leads us to contemplate the immaterial, leads us to contemplate God, the source of all of these things that you see in front of you. So the fusing, again, of two things, the material and the immaterial. There's an old saying, and this is from a good friend and mentor, Father James Shull, who once taught at Georgetown University. Jim Shull would say that the 13th century, wherein we find Thomas, wherein we find Francis, was the greatest of centuries. And I would throw in, of course, not to throw him in, but I would place as well Dante in this group. It is often remarked by great Catholic thinkers today, Catholic philosophers, that this is the greatest of all centuries. And you would think it's because the presence of Francis, Thomas, and Dante all together. Let's add one more thing. The 13th century with these men involved in it was great because it presents Christianity in its fullness, in its presenting to the world a coherent, rational, with faith as well, system of thought and belief that effortlessly fuses both the material and the immaterial, that presents us a material world that is not divorced from the immaterial world that created it. It presents us an immaterial world that can be accessed and contemplated because we try to understand the material, the world that is material. My last point here, there is one quote which begins hinting at something possibly problematic. At this moment of great triumph, of showing the fullness of this faith, there is the possibility of things going a bit off the rail. And we find this on page 139 of the Dawson book. Close to the end of the page, I shouldn't say, it's the middle of the page, give or take, in the first full paragraph, the paragraph that begins with, "But it is obvious." If you scroll down from that paragraph, there's a sentence that begins with, "As soon as the European mind." So again, this is from Dawson. As soon as the European mind began to exploit the riches of knowledge and power that the world contained, it began to turn away from the intellectualism of St. Thomas towards a purely rational and empirical idea of knowledge. In every department of life, the later Middle Ages witnessed a reaction from the idealism of the old religious culture. In philosophy, nominalism and criticism were triumphant. In art, realism took the place of abstract symbolism. In politics and social life, the unity of medieval Christendom was being broken up by the growing forces of nationalism and secular culture. The new peoples of the West, in the pride and vigor of youth, were preparing to emancipate themselves from ecclesiastical tutelage and to set about creating an independent cultural life of their own. Focus on the first sentence read here, that beginning with "as soon as the European mind." It's as if Dawson is saying there is a particular trait of human nature. There's a particular, how do we say, tendency in human nature. When we are presented that we can comprehend the material world and the immaterial as part of one whole system, as part of one unity, there is a part of human nature that says, you know what, I'd like to devote my efforts, my time, in only focusing on one. It is too difficult to try to peg down the immaterial. It is much more accessible, perhaps, to try to master the material world. After we can understand it, because Thomas Aquinas opens our minds up to this possibility of understanding the material world. It's as if the next human impulse, after understanding, ironically, is wanting to master it, wanting to perhaps dominate this particular field. Now, please note, it is very, very difficult to master or dominate what is immaterial. You can't apply leverage to things that are immaterial. You can't apply gravity. You can't push around things that are immaterial simply because they don't follow the laws of physics. They don't follow any sort of laws of matter. So therefore, perhaps it is easier to turn more of our attention over to what is material, and from that point on, try to understand, master, and in the future, dominate the physical world. It's a very strange trait of human nature in that sense. Okay, please, Mark.
I was going to say that although the material world is easy to study because it has laws of physics, for example, the immaterial world is still dependent on the laws of logic. So it's not as if there's no way to make progress in it.
Yes, we can think of the immaterial world as being bound by, if that's a proper term, logic in that sense, or rationality. But we can't corporeally affect the immaterial world. We can't sort of pull out a T-square and begin, sort of measuring what is not there to measure. And I think there's something in human nature that sees that as, although inviting to contemplate, the Greeks did to a very great extent. Although inviting to contemplate, there is a sense that it can't exactly, it's a shore that will never be reached, that will literally be reached, where you land your ship and plant your feet onto that shore. It's a place that is too distant. So therefore, focus then our efforts to something more, how should we say? Let's focus our efforts on something more accessible to us, to have a footprint on. And I'd like to throw in, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but maybe Lewis has something to say about this in Mere Christianity, when he talks about pride and how we're always trying to outcompete each other, how that's the nature of pride. It says it's by its very nature competitive. So if we somehow could master the physical forces of nature, that elevates us in a sense, right? I mean, there's a sort of lifting up of ourselves in that manner, which we can't exactly find or say, having understood a very complicated rational proof of Thomas Aquinas in terms of something that's immaterial, right? It sort of appeals to a different part of us in that sense.
Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else would have any questions before we take a short break?
I think one of the ironies of focusing on the material world is that you have to assume that you have a mind that's immaterial to do that. Yes. So it's a fool's errand to think that matter is all, because you're assuming you have a mind to contemplate it in the first place.
Very much so. And in keeping what we just said, if I could just piggyback on that, being purely materialistic opens up another interesting can of worms, in that morality is much more difficult than to discuss and convey. If we are simply material, then where exactly are the moral imperatives that say, do not harm beings composed of all matter? What's the point? What's the telos to that, really? I mean, to saying that if beings are all matter, and even Francis, by the way, is saying that even birds, right? I mean, yes, they're birds, they're not human beings, but there's something more to them. They have life, which is why we should treat them with dignity and respect. It does open up a little bit of an interesting kind of worms. If we are purely matter, then how can we go forward with moral edicts and moral imperatives saying that one should not harm matter? Well, I can fill up my mug with water and throw my mug down on the ground and affect it, but I'm not really doing anything immoral in that. Well, I guess if we had a drought, I'd be doing something immoral in that sense. If we didn't have enough water, but you'd be simply rearranging matter in that sense, not necessarily doing anything intrinsically immoral. Please, your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I find myself being constantly in this tension between on the material world, to which I'm really drawn, but I know I'm trying to escape. I try to somehow from time to time move away from, and I'm going to be next month. I'm going to be in Florence.
Oh,
so thank you so much for your introduction to the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella.
Of course, number one. Very good.
And the picture is right here on my little iPhone. So so thank you so much for introducing me to that. Maybe this will give me a jump away from the material world.
Very good. It's always good to link the material world, the immaterial world, with good tourism sites. I would say, and good makes for good visits in that sense. Thank you. I'm glad you're going. I'm very envious, by the way, but I'm glad you're going. Yeah. Have a wonderful trip.
Thank you.
And Hartman, when we post the video from 2 weeks ago, you might want to take a look, because there's a number of pieces of important art that Jose presented in that presentation too.
I couldn't be at the meeting 2 weeks ago. Right. I'll do that. No, I want to just make a comment on Dawson. I find him very difficult to read.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I'm trying very hard to get my mind into this book.
Yeah. Could I ask?
I admire you for being able to, and I also know Shaw and
sure.
Down and so on. And but it's tough. It was tough reading for me.
Could I ask what particular part of Dawson would be difficult? Would be the challenge? Is it the wording or the things?
It's the wording, yeah.
It's the wording. Okay.
So dense, and it seems to me it requires so much knowledge to really be able to move it in a way that would make it a little easier for me to read.
Yes, great, well put. Dawson belongs to a generation of academics. He passes away in 1970, the year I was born. But his generation of academics was very much like Lewis's generation, which comes after Chesterton and Belloc, the early part of the last century. What is unique about that generation of academics, I can say this from my own standpoint, my own perspective, is these were people who were extremely erudite in their own field, were very deep in their own field, but were quite able to speak on various amounts of other fields. Whereas today in academics, we have more of a specialization, sort of, you're really good in your own area, you don't necessarily cross over into other areas. Yes. A book, by the way, I'd suggest that is similar to this. This is from years back at David and Mary's house when we still did the meetings there. I believe it's a study of literature by Lewis. David, you remember this one? It's A Distant.
You're talking about The Discarded Image?
There you go. The Discarded Image, I have to honestly say, when I read it for the book review for the C.S. Lewis Book Society years ago, it was a very humbling book for me as an academic. Because here's Lewis, who, we know him from his Narnia stories. We know him, I read him in Screwtape, Mere Christianity. But in The Discarded Image, you see Lewis in his full form as an academic, as a person who is extremely deep in his own field of British literature, but at the same time able to make correlations to things that you wouldn't think have any ties to this. He was very adept at sort of being both deep and wide, but very, very substantial. In that book by Lewis, he never covers anything at surface value. He's always probing, which I think is what Dawson does. But Dawson is doing it, instead of in literature, he's doing it through history. He's trying to point out to us, if we look at history as events, that's good. We can learn history that way. But if we look at history as a story having more or less a very cohesive plot, we tend to do the same things throughout history. We tend to make many of the same mistakes throughout history. And we tend, when we do not make mistakes, but achieve at greatness and reach very lofty heights, it's because of certain things that we tend to follow. There's certain patterns in human nature. So I just encourage you, keep on reading though, because it's great. Dawson is fantastic as a writer.
My profession is I'm an economist.
Yes. Okay.
And so I'm down to earth, and I'm reading financial pages and things like this. It comes easy. For some people, it probably is hard to read that as well.
I'll have a very hard time reading those financial pages. I would consult you. When I look at the market, perhaps, for some advice. Very good. So the question becomes, where do we see this transitioning mentioned earlier when we left off with Thomas Aquinas? Where do we see this transitioning towards the material, or this focus on the material world, as perhaps being done at the expense of an acknowledgement of the immaterial world? We find it in very interesting places. We find it oftentimes in art. But let me first read to you something from Dawson in order to get our feet in the proper position to tackle this. Let's see. This is from page 144 from Dawson. Okay, this is in the second full paragraph from 144, middle of that paragraph, I would say, or I'm sorry, middle of the page, a sentence that begins with, "Thus it was the greatest." So close to the end of that paragraph, "Thus it was the greatest of the artists of the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci, who first realized the possibilities of modern science, not the abstract speculative knowledge which was the Hellenic scientific ideal, but a new science of experiment, an applied knowledge which would give man the complete mastery over nature." Key terms again here: complete mastery over nature. If you go over to the next page, over 145, last paragraph on that page from Dawson again. "But while the new synthesis," what he talks of in the previous page, "was infinitely superior to that of the 13th century on its physical side, it was inferior in that it no longer embraced the whole of reality. Not only had man lost his central place in the universe as the link between the higher reality of spirit and the lower reality of matter, he was in danger of being pushed outside the intelligible order altogether." Now, rather ominous words by Dawson. Let's see how we can see this with regards to art. This from a museum that my wife and I actually stumbled onto after looking at Dante's house in Florence. This museum being the Bargello Museum in Florence. This is a relief, bronze and gold, by the artist Donatello. Of course, is a crucifixion. That's what it's entitled. If you're in the Bargello Museum, you almost miss it. The highlights of the Bargello are some works by Michelangelo. I believe the Pitti Tondo is there. Also upstairs in the Bargello, you will see Donatello's David, which we actually looked at last year. It's a very different David than Michelangelo's, very young and sort of spriteful as a figure. This was Donatello's use of bronze and gold as a form of relief. It's actually literally on a board, on a wall at the Bargello Museum. You'll almost miss it, but if you find it, it's something quite to look at. Bronze and gold, it was, as it was described, a rather radical attempt to do in sculpture, in bronze relief, something that resembles a painting. Now, how do we make this correlation of sculpture to painting? Note, if you will, the use simultaneously of bronze, here the darker metal, and gold, the gilt work around, obviously around the sides, and in the various figures that you see in front of you. If you're familiar with the artistic term chiaroscuro, the idea of blending light and dark, you see this actually a lot more in Baroque art, where you see this, Caravaggio does this a whole bunch, where you see almost one source of light and a sort of like blending into a darker field, which gives greater emphasis and substance to the form of what you're seeing in front of you. Chiaroscuro first became famous apparently through Da Vinci, a contemporary, of course, and you will see this kind of light and dark play. Unusually enough, if you're fond of old silent movies, in German expressionist films of the 1920s. This use of light and dark is quite prevalent. If you're familiar with old 1930s movies featuring Marlene Dietrich, when she was directed by a director called Josef von Sternberg, one that comes to mind is the movie Shanghai Express. In film studies, there's such a thing called Dietrich face, where Marlene Dietrich gives us like face and like everything all falls into darkness. It is this use in a more modern way of something that began very early on in Florence's Renaissance. Now, in this case, of course, Donatello is using light and dark not in painting, but rather in sculpture. So what do we see when we look at this contrast of light and dark? Some rather curious things. Please note that the Renaissance was a time when the artists and thinkers of the period were rediscovering the ancient Greco-Roman pagan past, hence Renaissance, yes, the rebirth of this past glory of Greece and Rome. So what do we see elements of this? There were excavations being conducted throughout Italy. Artifacts from the earlier Greek and Roman times were being brought out to give us a greater understanding of what those people were like in that time. If I could draw your attention right here, it's a small thing, but something Donatello would have had to have seen at least, or at least studied. This Roman soldier, presumably with a spear, holds on his left arm what is called a scutum. This is the Roman shield. If you notice how it's built, and by the way, the use of light and dark, very, very delicately gold, having bronze at its border, this round object right here at the center of the shield of the scutum is a large iron boss. This tells us a lot about the Romans, by the way. No taller than 5'5", 5'6", a Roman legionnaire would literally use his shield as a weapon, would strike an enemy with this boss right here to unbalance them, and then proceed with their short sword to do great damage to them on the way to victory on the battlefield. We see in another soldier. This could be a Roman soldier. It could be one of the soldiers of Herod. We're not entirely sure, but rather interesting armor. A layer that looks like metal layered on his chest. This type of garment worn by Roman soldiers was called a lorica. And one of the more famous versions of this was the lorica segmentata. The key here is that the metal is plated. They're separate pieces of metal that sort of go on top of each other. Now, why separate and not one whole piece? If you have studied or read about the Spartans and the Greek way of war, they would sometimes fight with bronze chest plates that were solid pieces, which of course makes you very hard to kill. Unfortunately, it also makes it very hard to move. You're sort of stuck in this Spartan formation, this phalanx formation going forward towards an enemy. What the Romans did very creatively is make flexible armor to enable them to fight better than the Greeks, and hence conquer more peoples in the process. If we look down south at the lower portion of the work, we see, of course, the apostles and Mary Magdalene. I'm assuming this is Mary Magdalene over here, looking up with their halos above, signifying, of course, them not being the Roman soldiers, them being on the right side of the story. We see, ironically, Mary, Mother of God, who I'm guessing this is her because usually portrayed with a veil. What's interesting here is that her gaze is not towards the cross. Her gaze is actually away. It's sort of pointing in this manner, sort of pointing away from it. We see this also of turning away from another source. If we look towards the three crosses, the thief who is unrepentant on the left almost looks like either in pain or in anguish, he is looking up towards 2 o'clock right here. He is not looking towards the middle. He is not looking towards the cross. Now, whether this is because of shame or whether it's because he realizes he is, damned or what you will, we don't exactly know, but we see a different sort of orientation and distance, direction from the central figures on the work. The use of light and dark, again, to give more substance, more texture to what you're viewing. But then Donatello does something very creative, not by the use of putting gold or putting light, but the trees here in the background, behind the cross, not using gold, but rather being embossed, sort of sticking out from the flat relief, if you will. But they're shaped flat, almost like mushrooms. Now you'd wonder why, are there really trees shaped like this? But look at this one right here, which comes right under the sky. It's as if this sky is sad, it's heavy, it's ponderous, and is somehow being supported by this tree, not letting all of this great weight of this great tragedy come down to earth. Now, notice, if you will, for the last few minutes, I've taken your attention to Roman weapons, armor. On a side note, Roman infantry tactics in war, the gaze of Mary, Mother of God, the gaze of the thief. Those are only a few, by the way, of points of interest in this. Rather, I have to be honest in saying, when I saw this at the Bargello, I thought this was an exquisite piece of work. Until I started thinking about it, and it dawned on me that this piece of work lays emphasis on Donatello's skill, mastery as an artist. This is not the kind of thing that you can find somebody off the street and tell them, make me something like this. This takes a very high level, a very almost heavenly level of skill in order to produce something like this. But here's the catch. The focus is on the mastery, on Donatello's mastery of the art. We find ourselves with our eyes looking all over the place, at the Roman shield, at this one soldier's armor, at Mary looking down, at a million different things you can find in this particular relief. At the trees supporting heaven, who knows? What is the one thing we're not looking at? The central part of the narrative, the actual crux on the cross of the narrative. It is as if you remember the talk last week, when I showed you the painting by Sabatelli of Mount Olympus, and all of the gods looking around themselves. Yes, they're not looking at Zeus. They're looking around themselves. You know, Aphrodite is looking at Ares. Who knows which god is looking at each other? They're all carrying their own business on the side. They are spending all of their time looking around, but they're not looking at each other. We are now like those gods. We, the viewers of this Donatello relief, are spending our time focusing on Roman infantry tactics, armor, etc., trees sculpted in this way to hold up heaven. But we're forgetting that this is actually the main element of the story. It's a situation where human mastery over nature, Donatello's mastery and skill in producing something as exquisite as this relief, distracts us from the actual narrative, from the actual story. Does this story need to have these elements of Donatello? Absolutely not. You could do this story in a very simple way, which you saw last week, by the way, in the Trinità by Cigoli, where you basically have very few elements of a dying Christ being held by his Father and the Holy Spirit. You can achieve the same end, the same telos, but it brings up the question, now that human beings can master nature, can master the physical world around ourselves, is this too much of a distraction? Does it pull us away from something else? Now, here's the part where this gets a little bit ironic. As much as the focus here shifts from the central story to all of these various multiple narratives you see in front of you, this work by Donatello is impossible to produce without the narrative. As much as Donatello would like, I'm just guessing here, or as an artist like him would like to distance themselves from the actual narrative and focus on other things like Greco-Roman culture during the time of the crucifixion, as much as we would like to do this, we can't completely do it, because this is part of our DNA now. This is part of our philosophical and religious DNA. We can't divorce ourselves from it. In a way, we need the foundation, this foundation, in order to craft something as exquisite as Donatello's work. There is a point where Dawson highlights this on page 149 of his book. This is the second full paragraph, and this is very much tying up to this visual you see in front of you. Dawson says on page 149, second paragraph down, but in spite of its unorthodox and even anti-Christian character, and Dawson now, by the way, brief pause, is writing about what will come around several hundred years after this work of art. All the positive elements in the new creed were derived from the old religious tradition of Christendom. For a civilization cannot strip itself of its past in the same way that a philosopher discards a theory. The religion that has governed the life of a people for 1,000 years enters into its very being and molds all its thought and feelings. When the philosophers of the 18th century progressed, the Enlightenment, attempted to substitute their new rationalist doctrines for the ancient faith of Christendom, they were in reality simply abstracting from it those elements which had entered so deeply into their own thought that they no longer recognized their origin. 18th century deism was but, very important term, was but the ghost or shadow of Christianity, a mental abstraction from the reality of a historical religion which possessed no independent life of its own. It seems that Dawson is now pointing out that when we distance ourselves from the original well, so to speak, from which we drew our intellectual and spiritual water, the further we distance ourselves from that, the less vital, the less enlivening, or enlivened, the less energy we feel with whatever comes as a substitute. Dawson is warning that if we move away from what had historically given us life, vitality, and energy, then we run the risk of finding ourselves in a position where we still want those elements which we've just moved away from. Something simple about human nature, yes, especially if you read Greek history and Thucydides as well, various other historians, human nature remains fixed, according to Thucydides. There's one aspect of human nature that we often neglect, and this is often neglected in times of great success materially. That is that human nature, human beings, have a great desire to revere, to venerate, to see something as more than this world. Several Dawson books ago, I discussed over at the Independent Institute in Oakland that ancient hunter-gatherer societies in Europe, when they would go on their hunt, when they would bring down their animal from this hunt, before they actually began butchering and skinning the animal, they would conduct a certain rite or a certain series of rites. We see this, by the way, today, believe it or not, if one goes hunting in Central European countries, especially in Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. If one goes on a hunt, your guide at the end of the day, after bagging your deer or your boar, will actually take that animal and face that animal to where it last ate. It is as if respect was being given for thank you for providing us with this animal we're about to harvest and to eat at the end of the day. But there was a sense of something beyond. That is a very, very, very old rite. It has survived through millennia in Western Europe, Central and all of Europe, frankly. The willingness, the desire to find something beyond humanity that is the object of our veneration, that is the object of our thanks. That never goes away. So if we try to move away from the well again, and Dawson is saying from our historical roots in Christendom and Christianity, if we try to move away from this, we will often try to find something else to venerate, something else to hold as, dare I say, holy in that light. Taking us to page 176, before I show you the next visual, this is what Dawson says could be one of the more negative possibilities to arise from the situation. on page 176. Let's find that. Mhm. Okay, this is in the second to last paragraph of 176, the paragraph that begins with "it may, of course." I'll scroll down a little bit. The next sentence is "as the 18th century." As the 18th century abandoned dogmatic religion and still continued to advance in material culture, why should not the 20th century get on well without the liberal idealism, which is merely an unsubstantial shadow projected from the religion of the past? This is indeed what the world seems to be doing today. Again, this is from Dawson. We have entered on a new phase of culture. We may call it the age of cinema, in which the most amazing perfection of scientific technique is being devoted to purely ephemeral objects, without any consideration of their ultimate justification. It seems as though a new society was arising, which will acknowledge no hierarchy of values, no intellectual authority, and no social or religious tradition, but which will live for the moment in a chaos of pure sensation. Carrying over to the next page. Such a society is by no means inconceivable. It had its counterpart in the great cities of the Roman Empire, which lived for the games of the amphitheater and the circus. But it is obvious that such a civilization of this kind holds no promise for the future, save that for social disintegration. Moreover, the fact that religion no longer finds a place in social life does not necessarily involve the disappearance of the religious instinct, what I was talking about previously. If the latter is denied its normal expression and driven back upon itself, it may easily become an anti-social force of explosive violence. This is a sculpture found in our own San Francisco's Legion of Honor Museum, which I have to argue is one of my favorite places in the city. It has some great collections. This Rodin, of course, is one of them. This particular sculpture by Rodin is called The Call to Arms. I've dug up a little bit of research about this that has some interesting facts behind it. It was sculpted by Rodin right around 1879, and he wanted to enter it, Rodin did, in a contest to honor the defense of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War. It was, for whatever reasons, rejected. Rodin thinks it was too violent. It was too, who knows, too extreme in its depiction of violence. But nevertheless, it comes to symbolize a certain spirit of the time. We see only two figures here. One, a presumably dying soldier, and two, above him. She is described, by the way, by two terms in the research I've done. She is described as the genius of liberty, and by genius meaning sort of like a genie or spirit of liberty. But she is also described at the Harvard Art Museum as the genius of war. So ironically hints at the old goddess Ishtar in this sense, someone who is a god of multiple things that don't normally go together in that sense. We see here a dying figure who is propped up against the genius of liberty. If we look at the way he's being propped up, one thing we notice, yes, the genius may be indirectly propping him up by the position of the legs of the figure, but she is by no means cradling this dying figure. She's by no means supporting him with her arms. In fact, her arms are outstretched in a call for more of whatever she seems to be very excited about, some sort of conflict, at least in this situation. The wounded soldier, please note the direction he is looking. The wounded soldier is looking up at the genius of liberty/war, but she is not exactly returning his gaze. Her gaze is outward, not down towards him. And I've called him a soldier, by the way. The one thing that tells me he looks soldierly, it's a small thing, but if you look at the weapon by his left arm, this is some form of sword. But note, if you will, it's a very small thing. Look at this right here. We call this a lanyard, some kind of elastic object that affixes the weapon to your hand. Now, this is often found in the military throughout both world wars. Pistols from officers usually have a lanyard on them. The idea is very pragmatic. It's that you don't lose your weapon. It'll be connected to you, by your hip, by the holster, and it'll be accessible, and you won't lose it and need something else. So it connotes some form of militaristic enterprise the soldier was involved in, but it also connotes something else. When you have a weapon that you feel like you have to wrap around your hand really, really tightly, this brings up the concept of a last stand. Not only a last stand, but perhaps a doomed stand. Something you know you will lose. Something that you know you will be a casualty of. But you will fight very, very hard. There is no retreating on this day. There is simply the staying there and the fighting, although being brought low. Now, I call to mind again the genius being the goddess of liberty and war. I'd argue those two things have an incompatibility in one sense. If she's the goddess of liberty, as we understand liberty as the kind of freedom the Greeks would instruct us in, that being the ultimate form of freedom is where we know how to control ourselves. Yes, we are free, but we don't fall into license. We don't have our freedom ruin us. We have a good judgment, which allows us to use our freedom in the best way possible, hence liberty, which of course implies limits, self-limits. Now, looking at the genius of liberty / war, it doesn't exactly look like there's a whole lot of limits going on. You see a sense of abandon, a sense where she's flinging her arms outward. The wings are actually flapping over there, moving perhaps with the gusts of war or whatever is blowing at the time. Aside from abandon, I might be too bold by saying this, but there also seems to be a sense of abandonment, i.e., again, she is not cradling the dying soldier. He is, or at least looks to be, expendable. He looks to be a casualty. He looks to be a victim of a conflict, not for a faith or religion, because we've moved beyond that. Yes, again, this is in 1879. If we've moved beyond faith, then instead of fighting for faith, we fight for causes. Things we imbue with an almost religious hue or tint that give us the feeling of that old religion we departed from. This sense of abandonment of the soldier not being gazed at by the genius of liberty or war brings to mind the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, if you've read Kant, specifically Kant's moral philosophy, I'd argue, by the way, that Kant gives us, throughout the study of philosophy, one of the best secular systems of morality you could find. It does have limitations, but it does work to a certain degree. Kant says that for something to be moral, he says this in describing something he calls the categorical imperative. For something to be moral or good, it needs to be wished to be universal, meaning it's not just good for me. It has to be good for everybody else. But it's the second requirement of the categorical imperative that is important, according to Kant, or at least in my viewing of it. Kant says that in order to be moral, one must treat human beings as ends, not means. We are not, as human beings, to be used like so much kindling to some fiery cause. We're not some sort of expendable cost that falls to the wayside if we end our usefulness for whatever sociological purpose we're serving at whatever point in time. There is value in us as human beings. We should be treated as ends. And at least from the looks of it, there's not a whole lot of treating people as ends in this particular statue. I'd go even further from this and say that this statue, again, I'm not calling into account Rodin's skill and genius, not to overuse the word genius, skill and mastery of the subject. I think this is an exquisite sculpture. but the kind of spirit or message it is giving across seems to me, in the very, well, maybe it's a stretch, but allow me this little bit of latitude. It seems to me that this is, or at least symbolizes, a reverse or anti something you've heard of before or seen, a Pieta. This is not Michelangelo's more famous one. That, of course, is found in Rome. There is an interesting side story, by the way, to this particular Pieta or this sculpture. In that, when I was researching this, I could, after seeing it live and in person a couple of years ago in Florence, as my wife and I were in the Santa Maria del Carmine church in the city. It's on the opposite side of the city. You have to cross the River Arno, across the Ponte Vecchio, and head towards, I believe the neighborhood is Frediano in Florence. It's an old church which is more famous for its masterworks from Masolino and Masaccio. The frescoes there are very famous. Adam and Eve being cast out of paradise, very, very famous by Masaccio. This sculpture, believe it or not, was not in the chapel, where the Brancacci chapel, where you find Masaccio's works. It wasn't in another area of the church. It was simply standing by itself in a hallway, in a church hallway. There was no sign on it that said who was the artist, that said what time it was sculpted. It struck me as a particularly beautiful work, a very moving work. There are many versions. You've probably heard of Pietà, translates to pity from the Italian. It's usually with Mary and a dying Jesus or a dead Jesus. When you add the crucifix behind, it becomes a little bit different. It's a deposition, but this particularly is an art form called the Pietà. Now, looking at this, in keeping with the side story, I was only very fortunate in the last couple of days. I have a very good friend, old friend from school in the Philippines, who is a native Florentine, who actually was very kind and did some independent research for me, and found out that ostensibly, we don't exactly know precisely, but the best ballpark figure is this was constructed in 1923, so much later and much more modern than the works of art we've seen recently, by an artist. Again, this is only alleged. We don't have hard proof of this. By an artist, lesser known artist called Valmore Gemignani, who was an artist right around the turn of the last century. The background of the story, or of this particular sculpture, is that there was a contest in 1923. Please note that is 1 year after Mussolini takes over in Italy, 1 year after fascism takes over Italy at that point. There was a contest to honor Italy's mothers. And in the contest, of course, you submit your best work of art, and hopefully it gets picked. It gets picked. Gemignani submitted this. It was rejected. The story goes, and it ended up being lost for, for whatever. We kept lost track of it, and it ended up in that church, just sitting by itself on a hallway with no name, no artist whatsoever. But what's interesting about it is it's stark contrast from what you saw earlier in the Rodin. Here, of course, you see a much more familiar narrative that we're familiar with, yes? We see Mary holding her son, who's just died in the cross. Comparing this to Michelangelo's work, if you focus on Mary's face, she looks older, a bit emaciated, perhaps the stress, the strain, not eating well, who knows? It is showing in her visage, in her countenance, that she is a little bit different than Michelangelo's much younger Mary in his more famous Pietà in Rome. But note the direction of her gaze. Unlike Donatello, unlike the genius of liberty / war you found in Rodin, her gaze is exactly down towards Christ. There is no distraction. It is extremely vertical in that sense. To add to this, look at the position of Jesus' legs. And by the way, I have different versions of this particular Pietà, but this one I found most useful. His legs bent in a diagonal fashion, with the rear being slightly higher than the forward, bringing back the old Byzantine technique. I'm not sure that Gemignani wanted to use this, but it falls under that particular school. When you have a seated figure with one leg higher than the other, here you have two, with Mary and in Jesus. You are opening a space through which we, the viewer, have some sort of communication with the work of art. It is a space that invites us to contemplate what is happening in this work of art, the kind of suffering and pathos involved in this work of art. Note, if you will, how this narrative of this particular story is in striking contrast to what you saw with the Rodin. In this particular sculpture, what is the telos of Jesus' death? What is the point to his death? Is to save us from eternal damnation. So in contrast to the dying soldier looking up despairingly towards the genius of war, he was expedient. He was being treated as a means. In this particular story, who is the end? We are the end. The whole point of this is that this sacrifice is happening so we don't have to suffer from the mistakes of our ancestors in that sense. In this case, ironically, this God who can do anything, this God who is the Alpha and the Omega, is choosing himself to be the means to our end. And what is our end? To be with this God, because this God cares and loves humanity so much, or I mean, human beings so much in this case. Now, I bring up the dates from this work of art, 1923. 1 year into fascism in Italy, things are not going too well. Eventually, within a decade or so, things begin going not very, very well on the continent of Europe. But even in this time of great turmoil, of great trouble, even then, there is a work of art that is possible that communicates something that is thousands of years old, that people can understand, that brings together a unity. The unity of the material and the material and the immaterial, the unity of the earth and heaven itself, a whole system that we move away from, Dawson says, to our peril. We have to know what's involved in the movement away from this. So what exactly is the way in which we can avoid falling into what you saw earlier with the Rodin? And I don't mean to be repetitive, but we go back to something you saw last week. This is going to sound a bit simplistic in that I was trying to make something succinct or craft something succinct and transportable, but hopefully you'll find some substance behind something that sounds ratherly simplistic. What happens with progress, beginning in the Renaissance, seeing its full form in the Enlightenment, is we as human beings begin saying we would rather focus on mastering the physical world than taking the system as a whole. So what way can we avoid looking around ourselves and being distracted by things that are not so important? The way we do that is we look at each other. The way we do that is we realize that we are human beings first, and humanity, an abstract concept, next. We do this when we look at each other and realize we are whole human beings, and not only our attributes, and not only our membership in certain groups, that we are unique as human beings, and we deserve to be treated as ends. And in this particular faith, we see the greatest example of a God who moves heaven and earth itself to make sure that we are treated as ends in this case. So in a way, looking at each other is made easier if we are able to look up. If there is the verticality that is the gift of faith, it makes it easier, more facile, more possible, and perhaps more probable that we will begin looking at each other at our full value. Without verticality, think of the Donatello relief, then we're all just looking around ourselves. We're all impressing ourselves on how much we can master the physical world. But we are failing to take into consideration the value we have as human beings. I'd like to leave you with three closing thoughts from Dawson that perhaps encapsulate this book quite well, at least in my opinion. The first of these, and this is not Dawson, by the way, this is sort of my little synopsis of Dawson. The first of these points is that Dawson is saying religion is not a byproduct of civilization. It's not as if you built civilization first and then, somehow religion just kind of trickled down, from that source. What Dawson is actually saying is that you get religion first before you get civilization. Civilization only happens after people come together to form a culture. And what is that culture from? Frankly, it's from the cult. That's where we get the word, where you have the system of belief first, which you build the system of civilization on top as you're going forward. Second of these points by Dawson, second of his main points, for Dawson, religion not only provides what Aristotle says religion provides. Aristotle, in his book, The Politics, will say that religion serves a very important purpose of creating an adhesive for society, an adhesive like a glue to keep people together. We show this when we show acts of piety, when we show acts of observing old traditions. It brings people together because we have these old bonds, if you will, that keep us connected to each other. That's a good thing. But what Dawson is saying is that above and beyond serving as an adhesive, as a glue to society, what religion does is it gives society life. It gives it vitality. It gives it energy. And by the way, you don't have to take my word for it. All you have to do is look at art. Look at all of the art we've seen the last couple of weeks that is from a time influenced by Christendom, influenced by a guiding spiritual impulse, where the artist is trying to build something people can understand, but something also that conveys something that Plato talked about thousands of years ago. The artist is trying to communicate by showing you what beautiful things are. Now, if one moves away from the concept that there can be beautiful things, then it will be very challenging to produce something that we can rightly call beautiful. If there is no verticality that provides the objectivity through which we judge something as beautiful or not beautiful, then it becomes very, very challenging to produce something that is aesthetically pleasing in the very least. Third point by Dawson, and here he touches on progress. Progress was not an abandonment of religion for something other, something new or other. It is a moving away from an established religion. Think of the terms that Dawson used in talking about deism, where he talked about moving away from Christianity and de-supernaturalizing it, i.e. taking away the supernatural. What you are left with essentially is a ghost of an old religion. But here's the thing, and you saw this in the Call to Arms by Rodin, you saw it also in the Donatello. You can never completely move away from it. In a sense, moving away from faith, what the Enlightenment does, what progress does, is it's not saying we're going away from faith as faith. What it's really saying is we're going away from faith and we're making a new one. But now we have to be very careful, yes? When we make a new one, what is it built from? If it's built from something we've known and understood for a very long time, then what exactly are we moving away from? What gives it? What telos do we have? What purpose do we have in moving away from this? This is hopefully you've enjoyed my presentation on Dawson and my findings of what he has to say about the concepts of religion and progress. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have right now and make any comments you'd like going forward. Sure, Mark, go ahead.
The ancient Jews might have felt that regarding progress,
yes,
being within the faith as necessary, and that the Christians were therefore wrong because they were moving away from what the Jews regard as central to their faith.
Interesting. Would you say that the ancient Hebrew faith would also share what Aquinas and Francis were touting? That is, that what makes Christianity unique is this wholeness of the material and the physical. Would that be present, you think, in the older system?
I'm not being Jewish myself. I don't
right.
do
myself either. Right. It would be a very interesting question. I see what you're saying in that they would find criticism as almost Christianity moving away from it. Yes, but Christianity is not exactly moving away into a secular direction. It's moving away into another avenue, or at least another development of the faith that takes all of the old teachings, really, and brings it into I don't want to say more tidy, but at least a more succinct body of teachings, that of loving God and loving our neighbors, of the old law, portraying it that way. But also emphasizing, I would add, also emphasizing that we need to go beyond lawfulness and on to doing things to aspire to virtue, which of course the old Mesopotamian faiths you saw earlier with the Ishtar gate had a very difficult time with. The idea that there were certain things that were morally good to do, whether or not there was a statute saying you should do them in that case.
Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else would like to ask a question?
Sure.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Yulo. Very
No
fascinating presentation. I love all the visuals you used, and it certainly inspired me to go and research those a little bit and learn more about them myself.
I'm glad.
Yeah, some of what you said. By the way, Florence is also my favorite Italian city. So my wife disagrees. She thinks Venice is the best one.
Well, it's a different vibe in Venice and Florence. But anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. No, anyway, some of what you were going over, especially tonight, reminded me of a very fascinating book that I've gotten halfway through on fascism.
Okay.
Really sort of exploring and analyzing, the historical roots of fascism and trying to define it, because obviously it's a very loaded concept, a very loaded term that's misused tremendously, right? Almost everywhere you turn. And it's interesting. He uses several other thinkers and authors to basically, give a foundation to the idea that fascism is really rightly defined kind of an active resistance to transcendence. Okay. So it's this looking beyond, and again, suspicion of the abstract and the philosophical, and certainly the transcendent, and more of a focusing on the concrete. And that's where you saw, I think so unfortunately, dangerously taken to their ultimate ends. Those ideals are really, not just something that we can relegate to a criminal madman from the mid 20th century, or a handful of madmen, but just simply a very, philosophical undergirding for, something very insidious. So it sought to transcend, or it sought to basically stamp out the transcendent.
Yes.
And sort of put humanity back in touch with its so-called primal roots, right? Many reasons, not the least of which probably the Industrial Revolution, but, so it viewed people as being disenfranchised and disenchanted and sort of alienated from their natural environment, and sought to sort of uphold the idea of the tabula rasa, or
can you find that
blank slate, and try to restore people with their roots of naturalism, and and so it was interesting. I hadn't considered the fact that the Jews weren't only a race that Hitler had a personal beef with, but the fact that they represented, having the scriptures, the idea of transcendent law, and of a civilization based on morality, which is also something that fascist by nature, fascism as a philosophy tries to stamp out.
May I ask if the author of the book you read discussed the office of the consul in ancient Rome?
At least not yet, not as far as what I'd reached, but
okay. In ancient Republican Rome, yes, before the empire, you had a three-part system of government, wherein the executives of that government were called consuls, right? There were always two of them, and they served as a check and balance to each other. Like you can't have like one king, right? Like in Rome, they try to avoid that. Before Caesar, of course, this is during the Republican era. The consuls of Rome would walk through the city of Rome, being followed by men called lictors, who essentially were their bodyguards, who were former military people or former soldiers who were meant to safeguard the body of the consul for the time in office. The lictors, one of them, or maybe even more, carried a very interesting object. It was a bundle of very thin sticks tied together with an axe in the middle and an axe head protruding. This object, of course, being the fasces. where you said the root for fascism.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about that is that symbolized a certain kind of power that a Roman consul had. It was very similar to the power that a Roman father had over his family, which was literally back in that time the power of life and death. That you imbue this guy with this kind of great power. But here's the catch, though. In ancient Roman Republican society, even if we say, okay, you find the fascist there, the roots of fascism there, the ancient Roman Republican society was extremely aware of the transcendent. Rome was different from Greece in that it actually had a quality which, because of the ancient Greeks' brilliance, that they perhaps forgot, which was piety, which was the observance of obligation to gods. The Romans knew they would never be as brilliant as the Greeks. The Greeks are like the A students who don't even have to study. They're going to do well in any case. The Romans knew they were always the solid B pluses, but if they studied hard enough, they'd be able to leave an impact. And for the Romans, what made their culture unique, and we see this, by the way, when Hannibal comes very close to destroying Rome in the Second Punic War, is that Rome says, no, we're not going to surrender. We believe enough in our society, in our old ancestral gods. You're aware of in the great epic poems of that period, you have Homer and his Odyssey and the Iliad, right? And then you have Aeneas, who you see in Virgil. The virtue of the classic Roman in Aeneas, or the pre-Roman, is that he follows obligation. But obligation comes from the top. You don't give yourself obligation or get it from your kids in that case, yes? You get it from something beyond or transcending you. So perhaps when fascism makes its appearance in the 20th century, there is the shutting out of that element too. Not only of Christendom, but also the shutting out of the roots of where we even get the word. I'd also put forward that, ironically, the early part of the 20th century, where you see fascism and communism fighting the streets of Germany during that time very fiercely. Ironically, both of those ways of thinking, if you sort of like look at them very closely, yes, they owe a lot to Rousseau, to Enlightenment thinking in the 18th century. And what they owe, I think, to Rousseau is that in both fascism and in communism, there seems to be the message that human beings are not ends, as Kant was talking about earlier. Human beings are only valuable because we're part of some sort of larger whole. The group or the collective is always more important than the individual. And ironically, as different as fascism is from communism, they kind of come together in a very strange way,
Absolutely. I think that the book, I've always believed, and I think that the book sort of upholds the idea that really there's very little that's different fundamentally at the core between, let's say, extreme leftivism or Marxism, or however you want to label it, and fascism. I mean, they share, it's only kind of where you draw the demarcation lines in terms of class versus national struggle, or so on and so forth. But
very much so.
But yeah, my understanding has been that that again, it's this basically stamping out of the idea of the individual and the value of the individual, and more, as you say, a means to an end,
right?
And achieving a goal for a group or a collective. I've kind of noticed, I think to me it's fairly obvious that there's the difference with Christianity and most other systems, especially if you want to consider Eastern philosophy, for example, is the idea that, in Christianity you have the illustration of the body and members being, just elemental and indispensable members of the body that contribute a function because of their uniqueness and their giftedness.
Yes.
Whereas in Eastern, mysticism, let's say, and certainly probably fascism and most of the systems of the world, you might argue, it's just more, you're kind of a drop in an ocean or a cell in a larger body,
right?
Where it's not, there's not a substantive value there necessarily. So if you lose a few million, right, then there's no difference.
Right. Well, there was a question, by the way, somebody's asking you for the book and the author, if you could share that.
Oh yeah, it's Jean Edward Veith. I think he was, I don't know if he's still at Concordia in Wisconsin, but he was a professor of English there.
Great. Okay. Very good.
Thank you, Mark.
Jose, I don't know if this is apropos to your and Stephen's conversation, but N.T. Wright, of course, always has has asserted that Christianity is a spear tip of Judaism,
Right.
and also asserted that when during the 19th century Jewish reform movement, that a large majority of Jews would have turned to Christianity had Christians at that era not been hostile to Jews.
Okay. Well, thanks very much again. It was indeed a pleasure to present again for you this year.